From breakdown to the boardroom, that is how Nigel Cannings, CTO of Intelligent Voice, sums up his journey. In April this year, Nigel candidly chose to open up about his own experiences. Others may describe this decision as heroic, bold, brave, but to Nigel it was a personal choice, something he felt he needed to do, and in doing so wanted to help others, to start a conversation, a dialogue about opening up on mental health. Nick joins Nigel, sharing his perspectives as a carer, and together they consider the professions they work in, how attitudes have changed and how certain attitudes remain stubbornly persistent. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Skadi podcast.
Well, I'm pleased to be back on the Skadi podcast. We've had a little bit of a break, a little bit of a relax, and we're coming back with, as the Americans would say, a new season. And how, what an episode we've got. I'm really pleased to welcome Nigel Cannings to the Skadi podcast. Nigel, you are obviously Chief Executive Officer of Meet Minor. You founded Intelligent Voice, and Intelligent Voice, and you're the CTO. But you weren't, or maybe you were always a techie, but you come from a law background, I believe. You started as a solicitor, is that correct?
Yeah. I've always been a secret techie, but yeah, I trained as a solicitor, and eventually got into the law. But yeah, I'll tell you a bit more about that one as we move on. It was an interesting journey.
Well, it is, and this is going to be an interesting episode for us because around about the end of April this year, you and I are connected on LinkedIn, and we do talk things, investigations from time to time, and technology. You did a post that really struck a chord with myself for personal reasons, personal connections, and you took the step to write an article explaining to everybody about your own mental health and the fact that you had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and also how that has been, a big decision for you to talk about that, but as an entrepreneur and someone running their own company. And why was it, Nigel? What was it? Why now? Why did you decide that the timing was right to come out to talk to everyone about this?
Well, I mean, it's, what do we blame for everything at the moment but COVID, really? I mean, it's the mental health issues that I've seen people suffer during the pandemic are so immense, so crushing in many ways. I thought that maybe it would help some people if someone in my position, someone who, from the outside looks successful and fulfilled and happy in their career, were to actually stand up and say, look, there's a lot more behind me that you don't know about, and the struggles that I've been through and go through, to stay sane. And so I thought, if not now, then when, really? And in a sense, it was possibly, some people might say it was a risky move. I mean, while we see that mental health stigma is definitely fading, to kind of go front and center and say, guess what? I'm clinically mad, without wishing to trivialize it, but, was a difficult thing. But I thought, if I don't do it now, if I can't share my experiences, what is the point of what I've been through?
Well, I think it is amazing. And I've talked about striking a chord. So I'm going to tell you my story quickly, very briefly, but this is, your podcast too. And so absolutely the pandemic. So I'm thinking back now to April 2020. So a year ago, and Skadi, we had a big book of work. I myself was absolutely involved, getting stuck in, rolling my sleeves up in one of the largest investigations we've had to do to date. And in and amongst that, my younger brother, who has bipolar disorder, had an attack of mania, and went manic. And I don't, people listening to the podcast, I think there's a lot of cheap talk about mental health, but actually, until you've experienced a manic episode, i.e., either firsthand or as the carer for someone, it really is something quite extreme and quite difficult. And that was brought about absolutely, by the stresses and strains of the pandemic. So I sort of, I know very well what you have experienced, but from the point of view of a carer, and absolutely in the pandemic, that was the catalyst for him really starting to struggle with stuff. I think on top of, and this is sort of another sort of interesting angle of the pandemic, is the kind of the uncertainty and the suspicion about the government putting in lots of restrictions on people and so on and so forth. All of these things play, and they put people into a very difficult and stressful situation, I would think. So that's my sort of account out there in the open too, so people kind of know why I am interested in this subject. So I sort of throw that out there to you. What do you? I mean, this your episode happened to you sort of, I think you mentioned, sort of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So quite early in your career. So that was obviously out there. What was the attitudes like at that time? How have things sort of changed, or have they changed? Is there any real difference, do you think?
Yeah. So I'm older than I look, Nick. So 20 years ago, I was a long way into my career. I really was. No, I mean, it's actually hard to describe quite how resistant people were 20 years ago to talk of mental health in the workplace, and particularly something like bipolar disorder. So it's actually really been renamed bipolar disorder because manic depression is too scary a thing to say to people. It's had a rebranding. I think of myself as a manic depressive. I don't think of myself as being bipolar. That's just, it's a moniker that I own. Because people, it's always been in that category with things like schizophrenia and things which are considered to be paralyzingly difficult mental illnesses to deal with. And I'll tell you how bad it was. This is going to be an emotional episode, this one. So I diagnosed myself. So I knew what was going on. I was going through. So just for the benefit of any future employers, I am completely stable now, and I actually want to make sure we talk during the course of the podcast about how I recovered and what has happened to me since, because being bipolar, being a manic depressive is probably in a sense in the same way someone says I'm an alcoholic. It doesn't mean that I'm blind drunk on the floor all the time. It means I have a disease which is incredibly well controlled. So yes, I am bipolar, but am I a symptomatic person? No. But actually that discrimination I want to make sure we talk about as well, because there is still an enormous amount of institutional discrimination. I can't serve on a jury, because really? Strictly speaking, if you suffer from what is classed as a serious mental illness, you can't serve on a jury. There's no box that allows you to say, but actually I've not had an episode in 20 years. So I have to get my driving license renewed on a regular basis because it's what's called a notifiable illness. But there are good reasons for that. And there's much to talk about, Nick, and I don't want to digress from from your original question, which was really
I
about.
know we're in a conversation, Nigel, and I really want this to go where it goes. I'm finding this already really interesting for me, you know, and particularly some of the strands and the threads. So, I mean, I think one thing that I will say as well is that I think in doing this podcast, what I hope is that if there are people listening to this that are struggling and are, you know, if they can gain the confidence to get help, and perhaps we can talk about that, about how you know decided, because you as you say, you self-diagnosed, you realized you had this problem, but then probably the next step was actually giving into, and I'm using the phrase giving in, to get help, because as you said, there was a part of you that was worried about losing this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, when the thing that I was going to say before I went off on my last slight digression there was that to give you an idea of the prejudice against it at the time, I said I self-diagnosed. I was, you know, back in the days of dial-up internet. I was 3 o'clock one morning in the middle of what was then a hypomanic state, so I wasn't sleeping. I was kind of reflected back on my behavior over the kind of previous weeks and months, where I'd been kind of going up and then down, up and then down, kind of every couple of weeks. I was reflecting on it, and I thought there's just something very strange going on here. So I went to my PC. I did some research, and it basically said, yeah, you know, you're bipolar, you're manic depressive. So I made an immediate appointment with my doctor. I went to see my doctor. I said, hello, doctor. I said, here are my symptoms. I said, I am absolutely convinced that I'm a manic depressive. And what he said to me is, oh, you don't want to go around saying that sort of thing. He said, wow, no, it's very serious. No, you don't want to be saying that. He said, I'll tell you what, have some antidepressants and piss off, basically. So that was it. That was the extent of things. You know, it was more than just, you know, my own doctor refused to engage with it. And actually that refusal to engage almost killed me. So one of the for people who've not experienced a manic episode first or second hand, it's a slightly difficult thing to describe, but there's quite a lot of us out there, of us bipolar people, and you often see, particularly entrepreneurs. It's actually one of the reasons why I started talking about it. It's because there is a very high suicide rate amongst entrepreneurs as a percentage of the population, and partly that is caused by the fact there's also a significantly higher number of people who are bipolar who are entrepreneurs, because actually the type of personality that kind of is in a sense not generated by, but kind of reflected in the bipolar personality is that type of kind of slightly go-getting, you know, really thoughtful type of personality. So, you know, lots of, you know, we all know about people like Winston Churchill and so on, who are kind of famous manic depressives, but you know, often people who, you know, some of the most brilliant people to have ever lived were bipolar, because they had these incredibly elevated states. Which is, and Stephen Fry, again, someone who is bipolar, has spoken about it a lot, and has said that basically for him, you know, that kind of that high is something that he doesn't, you know, certainly didn't want to get rid of. So it, you know, for most people who live with bipolar, and if they're not medicated, what you generally find is you have periods when you have elevated thoughts. You're often speaking very quickly, and you kind of, you know, your brain's fizzing and you've got these incredible ideas for things. And then there are other days when you just can't get out of bed. And they tends to be cyclical, varies person by person. But that state of elevation is called hypomania. So it's, you know, and And for some people, that's incredibly productive. Those, people write music, they write books, they, or talk nonsense, which has always been my thing, or, they invent computer programs, whatever it might be, but they kind of use that. A manic state.
A friend that's very, very dear to me, she was managing to operate, I would say, 6 or 7 schemes or projects, be them jobs, things that she was going to do, organize, all at once in this sort of hyper state, because she was just able to do so much and had such boundless energy for doing all these things. So I know what you're describing here, that energy.
Yeah, but the thing is, a manic state is something very different. So a manic state is often characterized by delusions, often by hallucinations, can be extreme paranoia. My doctor told me a story of one person who was committed, who was standing in the middle of the road, believing they were calling lightning down from the heavens just by putting their hands up in the air and calling it down, and they believed that. So a manic episode is, and clearly you've experienced it as a carer, someone who is literally delusional. And the problem that I found myself with is that actually I'd never had a full-blown manic episode at the point I was in the kind of pre-state. It was, things were getting worse, but and had I received proper treatment at that moment, I would never have had one. Because I went home and I said to my wife, I said, I've been to the GP and he's given me these antidepressants, and she sort of slapped me around the head and said, you got private medical insurance, you should insist on seeing a consultant immediately. And so I went back as soon as I could get another appointment, which was about a week later, and I went back in and said I needed a referral. And so I went off to the Priory in Roehampton, saw a specialist there. He said, well, yeah, it's okay. So 2 things, Mr. Cannings. He said, firstly, yeah, absolutely right. Quite obvious, you know what's going on, a lot more than your GP does. And he said, and secondly, these pills that he's given you are incredibly dangerous, because if you give antidepressants to someone who's bipolar, it can take the lid off the mania. So effectively, what happens is you go up and up and up and up. The regulation mechanism isn't there. And he said, the trouble is I can't take you straight off them. He said it would be incredibly dangerous to take you straight off them. I wanted to continue working because I didn't want people to know. So he said, look, I'll give you something which we hope can, reduce the effect of it, and hopefully we can wean you off these antidepressants. All will be well, the world, yada yada. Didn't happen. So unfortunately, I found myself on a business trip in a hotel atrium, literally convinced that I could see the devil and his entire host, like in an atrium on a wall. Mm-hmm. I mean, and when I say it sounds crazy saying that, it's because it was crazy. I mean, literally, I was hallucinating, and it's the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I mean, of all the things, and I fled the hotel, and I ran to my room. I grabbed everything I had. I just grabbed it. I ran out of the hotel, got into a taxi, realized I'd left my passport and my wallet in the safe, and I paid someone to go back in and get them out for me because I couldn't set foot in a hotel again. And ran to the airport, tried to charter a plane home, because that's the sort of thing you do when you're in that type of state, which you can't do at 4 o'clock in the morning, it turns out, by the time I'd found somewhere to do it. And then managed to arrange a flight home the next day. And basically...
that's an amazing achievement, because I was going to ask you, and that was one question I had when I was reading about your experience, is it's one thing for it to happen in your home country. It's completely another to find yourself, one, in another country which may have very different cultures to our own, and also a very different level of acceptance and understanding of what you could be going through.
Yeah.
And then also just the actual physical difficulty of getting yourself home in that state. And then when you get yourself home, you know, everyone knows when you land your plane, you're still 3 hours from the safety and security of home, because you've still got to go through baggage control, immigration, navigate the way home. But of course, you know, in that state, that's no problem, because as you say, you probably just get a helicopter.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
much easier.
Money becomes secondary in these times, which is a symptom as well, right?
It is a symptom.
I know,
yeah.
a symptom, but yeah, it goes hand in hand, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. So I mean, I was actually incredibly lucky. So I had private medical insurance. I'd had critical illness cover. So if I'd lost my job at that point, I could have continued getting an income. And actually, whilst my employer at the time overall was not enormously sympathetic, my immediate boss was an absolute superstar. I mean, I'm not going to name him on here, but if he were listening in, he'd know who he was. And he was just amazing, because he basically protected me from the organization, and which allowed me to and I took 6 months off work at that point, and just very slowly recovered. I had 2 weeks in the Priory. I got out. I was definitely the sanest person there. You know, I felt a bit like Jack Nicholson. You know, he's just kind of looking around thinking all these other people are mad. There's nothing wrong with me. And then 6 months at home, getting medication right, understanding more about the illness. And I went back to work, and kind of that was it really. And no one knew where I'd been, pretty much. It was like, you know, oh, you've been off sick, Nigel, have you? Yeah, it's no one would tell us what was going on. So yeah,
that's amazing for that person to do that for you. When you look back at that and you think about that person, is that because that person was just a good person, or do you think that was because that person had some empathy because they perhaps themselves had experienced what you were going through? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't. He was certainly one of the nicest men I ever met, I have to say. So I think he was just one of those people he was just a very kind and caring man. And I was very lucky to have him as a boss. He was located 6,000 miles away as well. So it was even more amazing that he managed to do it from that distance. So just kind of pushed me away. And you know, 1 or 2 colleagues in the UK knew what was going on, and they'd know who they are as well, who were also very supportive in terms of just making sure that people can phone me up and ask me what was going on, and just kind of left me alone, really. And after 6 months, I was able, you know, went through some occupational therapy and was able to return to the workplace, almost as if I'd not been away.
It's an incredible story, Nigel. There's a few things that I want to really dig into here. So I could do them in any order, and I think there's a lot of stuff to go through here. But I want to talk about the entrepreneurship, because I consider myself to be an entrepreneur. I know the guys. I drive the guys inside Skadi pretty mad. But I'm interested in that connection between entrepreneurs, the incidence of bipolar and mental illness. You've also talked about substance abuse. There's obviously a lot of pressure in the role of an entrepreneur. There's a certain amount of intoxication just because of the nature of entrepreneurship. There are big wins, there are big successes, and there are devastating lows. There is dreadful anxiety to deal with on a daily basis, because you're not just worrying about yourself, whether you will fail, the organization will fail, but as you grow and as you become more successful, you attract a growing business with employees that you have to care for and consider and care about as well. And I'm just wondering about, one, whether entrepreneurship attracts people in because of that sort of that potent toxic mix of euphoria and feelings? Or is it perhaps, you know, for you, is it the case that people end up being entrepreneurs because they have to really plow their own furrow, because organizations, or certainly 20 years ago, which weren't as accepting, and I don't know if the difference is there now, to be honest, whether it's actually because they end up not being able to stay in organizations, and it's actually easier and a choice to go out and strike out alone because they have to, you know, have to make ends meet, they have to carry on with their life. What would you think to that? And I know there's quite a lot to unpack in there, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak for myself. But I'd kind of reached the point where I couldn't work for anyone anymore. I mean, I'm not sure. I actually have to look back and say I was a horrendous employee, and you know, and really, this is a chance to apologise to a whole bunch of people I worked for over the years who I thought were, you know, complete tossers at the time, but I now realise it was probably me, and I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, I have a terrible tendency to be right about things, and actually 95% of the time I am genuinely right about it, but it's the 5% when I'm not, but I'm convinced I am, which not unsurprisingly kind of really annoys people, and I kind of see that about myself now. So I just reached the stage, and actually the funny thing about me ending up being an entrepreneur as I am is I wanted to do it much sooner. I mean, I almost got suspended at school. I was 8, I think, when a friend and I, so I was at a school which had a few boarders, and it was mainly day boys, but there were a few boarders there at prep school. And so a friend and I, he had a fishing tackle box, and so I stumped up the money to go and buy sweets from the little kind of the corner shop near the school, and we put them into his fishing tackle box, went onto playing fields and sold them to the boarders. And turned out the school weren't very happy about that. So I was my venture into selling sports socks was mentioned by my best man in my wedding speech. I went through a phase of selling sports socks and portable greenhouses. And when I was at high school in America, I basically ripped off the school jumpers, because the school shop had run out of the jumpers. You know, all schools have got, you know, all the names emblazoned across them. Well, I saw a gap in the market. My roommate's mum had just started a printing business. So like, great, let's go and print a load. Made a fortune in relative terms for someone who was at that point just turned 18. So I'd always been really interested in it. And my dad, had always, he was a salesman at the beginning of his career, but he started his own company in the late 60s, and stayed doing that. And in fact, he was the first person to sell a personal computer in Europe. So we, small aside, we went on holiday to America in 1977 to the West Coast. Quite unusual then for Brits to find their way out there. And I remember we were there because Elvis died while I was there, which meant a lot more to me. But actually, he was going around all these little garages buying bits of kit, and came back to the UK in 1978, opened this thing called the Bike Shop, and was selling personal computers, the first Commodore PET, long before Sinclair and his ZX 80s and 81s. My dad was selling these things. So I could have grown up around entrepreneurship, around, we didn't call it entrepreneurship, it was businessman back in those days. Anyway, so I spent a year in the States, and I think, again, this is kind of, I should have noticed early on that I was fairly single-minded and determined about things, because I was like, no, I'm going to go and spend a year at school in America. Why not? Came back, walked into his office and said, right, I said, clearly I'm supposed to be going to university now, but I said, really, I want to start my own business. I said, I want to do what you do. I want to run my own business. I was very proud of my father. And he looked at me, and and saw me for the first time in his life. 18 years he's managed not to do that. And he said, have you got any effing idea how hard it has been to get here and do all this? You just turn around and say you want to do this. He said, go and get a proper job. And he said, if at the end of it you want to be a businessman, then we'll talk about it. So anyway, so I went off, became a lawyer. Because that was couldn't stand the sight of blood, so I couldn't be a doctor. Many of, and I can't add up. So, many of the usual professions weren't really open to me. Anyway, and I was very successful. I mean, I did extremely well as a lawyer. I worked in house. I made money out of stock options. I worked for tech companies. I ended up being a tech lawyer because the law firm I worked at, my very first law firm, I was literally the only lawyer who could turn a computer on. All the secretaries knew how to do it, so I became the software license guy. But anyway, so yeah, I came out, I made some money out of stock options, and I left, and I walked back into his office. I was 35 at this time, so I was 18 when I first walked in there, and I said, right, I'm ready. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, no, do you remember that conversation we had when you said that when I'd gone and got the proper job and I was ready, I could go and become a businessman? And he's no idea what you're talking about. And basically all it was, of course, I got and bothered him in his office on a bad day. He told me, he just effectively told me to sod off. And I'd lived by this mantra, I'd lived by this. And so I had a few quid in my pocket and started my own business, basically in the depth of a recession, kind of 2007, 2008. Terrible time to start a business, but I just had to do it. I absolutely couldn't. It was a series of steps which just sort of happened. And so, yes, I think a lot of it is from an individual perspective. It wasn't for me put another way, if I knew then what I know now, that's the big question, isn't it? Did I realize how hard it was going to be? No, I didn't have a clue. I absolutely had those things that you described earlier about the anxiety and the lows that go with it. Your job as a business leader, and again, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the article earlier in the year, is because your job as a business leader is to present this kind of complete air of unflappability, of infallibility. Your job is to be the duck across the pond. That's all anyone sees, without the little legs flapping around underneath, making everything happen. And the larger the business becomes, the more you feel that strain and that burden that goes with it. So I don't think I would have changed my mind about it. But in a sense, I kind of wish I'd been a bit better prepared for it. Yeah. I really do. I wish I'd have known that. Yeah, I suppose because I'd seen my dad do what he did, and he sort of made it look easy, in a sense. He kind of, and I think that's one of, and this is the kind of the cult of entrepreneurship, the myth of entrepreneurship. We see certain people who have been unbelievably successful, and we worship them. And I don't think we should. I really don't. I think that, there is not an honest discussion about, what happens to most entrepreneurs. Actually, many people who start businesses are unsuccessful. Or, they don't become multi-billionaires. How many of us are multi-billionaires? They have sleepless nights worrying about how they're going to pay their VAT this quarter. No one talks about that. Yeah. Those are the conversations which, if we're going to teach people, if we're going to give them the skills that they need to get through it, not just from a business perspective, but from a mental health perspective as well, there is a whole toolkit that we should be giving to people before they start. To me, it's almost morally wrong to take a young person and say, either here is a small amount of money, go off and run a business, or here's a large amount of money, and go off and run a business, or here's a few tax incentives, go off and run a business. But we look at business support from a financial perspective, and clearly you run a business, financial support is great. Cash is king, all the usual type of stuff. But actually it's that the very types of people who are more willing to step out of their comfort zone and start their own business are exactly the type of people who are most likely to suffer from what comes with doing it. And that to me is the bit I think that we're not very good at.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take, a really interesting one. I want to unpack something else, which is really to take you and I back, because we both were from professions, and they're very important to us still. So obviously your legal background and my banking and finance background. I was a trader dealing with immense pressure over the years. I've traded through a number of crises, and something struck me about the fact that you said, this very special boss and the people around you in the UK that knew what you were going through, effectively kept people away from you and didn't ring you up. And we both were in industries at a time, and I'm not sure whether this is the case now, but it certainly was at the time when I was working in finance, and particularly when I was in Asia. We were at the beck and call of anybody, and we were responsive to anybody. I mean, I was a trader, I had to make prices. I'd get rung up 3 a.m. because someone wanted a price in a convertible bond that I made a market in. And I would make that price, half asleep in bed, but I just knew where all the prices were.
Yeah.
Not to say I always got it right, but, but generally, that was what this would happen, this would occur. And do you think that that kind of bargain, I would say, that we struck, because those industries compensate individuals very highly in terms of financial terms, financial rewards, but perhaps there's a bit of a price to pay, and do you think that's got any better? What's your views on that, Nigel? What do you see?
I think it's a bit opaque still, actually, in terms of what's really going on the inside. Because you're absolutely right. The what you might characterize as a macho culture of hard work, stay late. I can remember doing, you would do M&A stuff, and you'd barely leave the office for a week, and someone would be sent out to buy you a shirt. It's because you had to have a shirt, and that sort of stuff. Or I can remember having been at work for 36 hours straight at one point, coming out and meeting the Spice Girls. I did actually meet the Spice Girls, but I thought I was hallucinating at first, because it actually turns out that the Sun they were filming Spice World at the time, and the Sun had given them all matching Mercedes SLKs. And on the 1st of August, on the new registration day, and they're all coming out of Twickenham Studios, which is just right by my house. And I walked out of the station, and there's the Spice Girls there. And you think, oh my God, I've been awake for 36 hours straight. I'm hallucinating Spice Girls. It's got really has got bad. But anyway, so it was very much a kind of work hard, play hard, get paid well type of culture. But actually, there's a lot of good talk now from law firms and people like that about how they're protecting the mental health of their employees and that sort of stuff. I'm going to make myself really unpopular with this comment. I bet you I could text any partner at any law firm that I work with at 9 o'clock at night and say, right, we've got to do a deal tonight, and they do it. Yeah. And still do it. I could harass some poor assistance lister and make them stay really late, because it's the there's such a struggle there between the billable hour, the demands of these types of job, So we talk a good game about it. I think some of the worst excesses, I mean, the long lunch is probably a thing of the past, I would have thought, in the city, although there are those people who think that that was one of the few decent compensations for all the hard work that got put in. So I'm not sure whether it has changed as much as people would like to say it's changed.
Well, you've touched on another thing, which is perhaps quite a toxic thing that was part of the culture, is that, if you had a tear up with someone on the dealing floor, and you had tear ups all the time, because people care about money and they care about profit, and they care about their customers, and you care about protecting the book and the firm as a trader, and you will be at someone's throat. And the textbook resolution for that was that after work, we'd all go out to the pub and have a few drinks, and everything would be sorted out for the next day.
Yeah.
But these tear-ups were regular enough that, we were probably going to the pub quite regularly too to resolve things. And you can see that you start getting into some toxic behaviors, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm entirely sure that was, it was kind of expected, really. And I think that, one of the good things, I mean, that has happened in certainly my children's generation, is that their attitude towards drinking and things like that has changed. I'm not saying that they don't drink, and I'm not saying they don't do drugs. I'm sure there are plenty of people I used to work with who kept themselves going all night with a bump or two of Coke, or got over the hangover with it. It kind of inevitably, really. But I think because, and this is a fantastic thing to see, with the number of people from ethnic minority backgrounds who are coming into the professions, who, in many cases are coming from a culture where drinking is either prohibited or frowned on. It actually begins to mean that you can't kind of force people into a drinking culture. So the firms themselves have to say, and I've seen a few law firms now saying that, the firm will just not supply alcohol, for mixers and things. It's just, and I think that is, I'm sure the Nigel of old would have been horrified, but the older, potentially slightly wiser version is delighted to see that, because there was the pressure to do it, and that's just not good for people. It really isn't. It's I think that drinking socially is great, but it should just be done in a social way, and not something which is a kind of forced upon you and is used as a means of self-medication. Just returning to the mental health thing.
That's exactly the phrase, isn't it? Self-medication.
Yeah.
We've talked for so long, Nigel, but there's one area that we must go in, because I've got you here, and you're the best person to ask this question. And you've talked to people about the fact that when you're manic, you get this raised speech, things are working quicker.
Yeah.
And your business is a fantastic business focused on voice communications, voice technology. And we know about that from our investigation work at Skadi. Is there any way, do you think, that companies could utilize voice technology to help them understand and look out for their staff through looking at things like speech patterns? Is that a possibility, or am I being a bit sort of out there?
I've actually written a few articles about this recently, because it's an area that fascinates me. The simple answer is that yes, you could. There are ways in which you can start to judge behavioural patterns. So unfortunately, the way it's being applied in most cases at the moment is to try and make salespeople more effective. So most of the money that's going into that type of speech stuff at the moment is being thrown at companies who try and make your salespeople more effective. So you tell them what to say or what not to say, or ways in which you can manipulate your customers better. But the same basic techniques can be used, but there is a very serious side to this, that it's still relatively crude. So taking that thing about the speech, for example. So as I said, when, fortunately, I've not had any form of kind of manic or hypermanic episode for so long now, I can't even remember. But that level of fast speech could just be someone being excited about something. I get really passionate about stuff. I'm very careful when I'm doing podcasts and things to try and not start gabbling, because I get incredibly passionate about the things I'm talking about. And actually, particularly when I'm trying to reassure people that I'm not hypermanic, I try not to speak too quickly as well. But it's kind of, you've got to be careful about these things. And I think that it would be possible, and it is possible, to look at people over a period of time. And that's the thing. It's very difficult for a point in time. What you need is a frame of reference around an individual, and say, well, actually, what we've noticed is the overall sentiment. Let's just, sentiment's very crude measurement, but let's use that one for the moment. The overall sentiment of the calls that Nigel has been involved in over the last month have shown a steady decline. Generally back in January, he was really positive, and now we're in February, not so positive. So maybe we can take something from that. Or in fact, not only is he becoming more positive, he's speaking much more rapidly, to the extent that actually he's reaching a word per minute level where people are finding him difficult to understand. And this is a problem. And so there are things that you can use to detect that. You can start looking for disfluencies. So for the more people have to kind of stop and think and so on, they can be indicators of deception, but they can also be indicators of depression as well. So yes, but here's the big question, right? Let's say that I put a system in somewhere and its job is to monitor the mental health of my employees. How open to abuse is a system like that? I was talking to someone the other day whose company was taken over by a large private equity firm, who have installed key loggers on everyone's PC just to make sure that they're typing all the time. And people are actually being measured on this. And it's like, is typing a sign of productivity? No. But that is a metric that's been used. So let's say I got taken over by a large private equity firm, and they decided to start monitoring how I sounded. At the end of the month, do I get a report through saying, Nigel, we noticed you didn't seem very cheerful last month. And that could be for any number of reasons. It could be for the fact that, so for me, this is my worst time of year, the hour change. So I have a seasonal, I'm because everyone likes to be different. I'm not only bipolar, but I have SAD as well, seasonal affective disorder. And so what that means is I've always had a seasonal element to my condition, which I control using light therapy. So I have a light box, and from about September to April, I use my light box every day. It's great, gives me the serotonin I need. But this is the weird week, the week when the hour changes, and I'm always a bit kind of a bit wobbly this week.
I'm glad we booked the podcast now.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you'd done it next week, it would have been a very different story. We might have to come back and do a follow-up just to prove that Nigel is actually fine. There's nothing wrong with Nigel. It's postscript. But yeah, it's one of those things. I've completely lost the train of where I was going now with that one.
So you were talking about the fact that you have a seasonal.
Being monitored, but that's the point. Yeah. So Nigel, so my score for next week is probably going to be different to other weeks, but it's just it's a thing, right? It's not a big deal. So it's a very long answer to a very simple question, but yes. So I think it's actually better as a diagnostic tool. I think that, see, where I see this being better placed is to help in diagnosis. So rather than a workplace monitoring of people, which is intrusive, it's difficult, and very open to other influences. Because the fact is, if I've just got an email from my boss asking me to redo a piece of work that I spent weeks on, I'm going to be pretty pissed off about that. I want to be negative and angry. It's not an indicator of the fact that necessarily that I'm under stress. You know, what I would say, what's actually more of an indicator that I'm going to be under stress is the fact that you know, I was online at 3 o'clock in the morning doing emails. You know, you don't need speech patterns for that. I mean, anyone, you know, any single employee who sends an email at 3 o'clock in the morning should be taken to one side and heavily medicated for several months and just said, stop, you know, stop, whatever you do. You know, there are ways in which, you know, sensible employers ought to be able to deal with that sort of stuff. But as a diagnostic tool, so if, for example, so if you were my doctor, Nick, I think you make a great psychiatrist, by the way, so you should definitely think about that.
I have a brother, but anyway, the other
yeah,
brother.
So there you go. So there you go. Clearly runs in the family. But you know, if I spoke to you regularly once a week, let's say you're a robot. You see, here's the thing, we're getting to the point with conversational AI now, where actually we can train conversational agents, which are extremely lifelike, not just in terms of the tone, but also their ability to interact and guide and answer questions. And so there's a lot of work being done. People like OpenAI with GPT-3, Facebook, BlenderBot 2, a whole bunch of these new Google T5, all of these things which are capable of taking us to the next level of human computer interaction. So we could, if we wanted to, allow people to have a weekly download, weekly chat with a kind of an online therapist, almost, really, and use that data, which is actually much more structured. It's a time which has been set aside for focus, and see what the difference in reaction is week by week. And I actually think that one of the huge advances that we're going to see in the next 5 years is the ability to manage and diagnose mental health conditions online like that. Because frankly, whilst, you know, I'm sitting here pretending that there is no stigma around mental illness, I know there's a whole bunch of people who, if they bother to tune into this podcast, are going to walk away thinking, oh yeah, well, that Nigel Cannings, you know, he's not going to go, you know, see the devil next time I see him, is he? You know, he's not going to go loopy on me or something. You know, 80% of people who listen to this hopefully think, good on you, Nigel, well done, thanks for standing up. 20% are not going to be happy. And the fact is, we're still afraid of those people. You know, I'm not unafraid about having come on this podcast today to talk to you about my experience. You know, I'm being reasonably, you know, we've great degree of levity to it, but the fact is, you know, I know that there are people out there who view mental health as, you know, well, it's your fault, pull yourself together, what's wrong with you, you know, how dare you give other people, you know, they're going to think I'm going to give people ideas now, you know, that, you know, they can skive off work by saying they saw the devil. You know, it's an issue. So if 20 years ago I could have had an immediate interaction, 3 o'clock in the morning, they should have known, right, when I was, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I could have talked to something empathetic, which would have helped guide me through some of the issues and questions that I had. I don't mind talking to a robot. I mean, I really don't. You know, I loved my doctor. It was very expensive, but you know, the fact is, I have a very, because it's always a good thing to do, I make sure I have regular meetings with my doctor. You know, it's always good to check in. they check your medication, check everything's fine. But frankly, that's once a year, pretty much. If I could have had that interaction straight away. So, if I weren't doing what I'm doing now, which is trying to stop traders saying bad things in banks on phone calls, what I'd probably do is go out there and try and raise $100 million, because I should do it right this time, to build that very thing, for that kind of that mental health coach. That and we were involved in a European project over the last couple of years, which was dealing with helping the elderly, so using avatars and so on, and conversational agents to help the elderly. But actually, I think that, from my own experience, the ability to talk to, we call it shrink online or something like that. You heard it here first, and that yeah, exactly. So, or shrink wrap. I don't know. There's definitely there's shrink in there somewhere. But there are we're going to see some astonishing advances in conversational technology over the next 5 years, which, used correctly in healthcare, could transform the way we deal with mental health, because there's no investment. We've not talked really about, we were going to touch on how much time, how many hours you've allocated this, Nick, but
I've got to have to say, Nigel, we've talked a long time, and I think you've owned up some massive subjects. I'd love to talk to you again, because I think there's more we could explore, if you would be open to that. If we could, then I think we should do a part 2 and start exploring into some of these things. But I found that absolutely fascinating. I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for your candor, your honesty. It's emotional for me.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for having me on. It's something, I think it's an important topic. I'd love to come back. I think we should talk about how people can get help.
That's absolutely right. And I think one thing you have done is, I think you've started a conversation for people, and I hope people that are listening to this that may be struggling can realize that the help is just a phone call away, and you can reach out for help, and there are people that understand.
Yeah, I mean, contact me on LinkedIn, hunt me down. I'm not a difficult person to find. I will always try and help where I can. There's no money, no medical advice, but just help and assistance if I can. So if there is anyone out there who is struggling, who is feeling, if you feel suicidal, call the Samaritans. Don't call me. Call the Samaritans. Do it now. Right this second. If you're feeling suicidal after listening to this podcast, then you can call me. And then, that's because that was my fault. But seriously, I'm delighted to have been able to talk to you today, Nick. And yeah, I'd love to come and follow up on another call, on another podcast, definitely.
Well, there's so much we could talk about, and I really want to thank you, Nigel. Thanks very, very much. That was Nigel Cannings of Intelligent Voice. Thanks very much for talking to us about mental health.
No worries. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Skadi podcast. If you or someone you know has been affected by the issues covered in this episode, or you would like an improved understanding of mental health, please visit mind.org.uk. If you find yourself or someone you know in urgent crisis, please find immediate support at samaritans.org. Above all, we hope this episode can help start open and frank conversations in the workplace and continue to break down the stigma that still surrounds mental health.